This video is sponsored by Obscura VPN. With Golden Demon Adepticon done and the winners walking away with their trophies, it's time to pay our tributes to those that stood there near the podium but ended up empty-handed. It's time to look at the remaining finalist entries of Adepticon 2026. Thanks a lot to Games Workshop for putting out these finalist photos. It really gives us the bigger picture and a lot more insight into how fierce the competition was each time. So let's go. And let's start with the Warhammer 40k category, which had 9 finalists, which makes it the category with the most finalists of the competition. And right off the bat, we have this Flawless Blade by Lucas Viggering, who has won 2 demons in other categories. If you haven't seen my breakdown video of all the winners, I'll link that in the description. Go check it out after this video. Lucas has kind of dialed in his style towards that overall kind of muted scheme with a few strategically placed specks of light. Here you can see that on the swords, the extensions on the backpack, the sash and some of the gold. I really like the scheme. There's a lot of colors repeating in the individual elements, like the highlights on the purple are also part of the skin color. You can see the slight sheen of purple in the sash, and then there's a lot of color variety in the bright pauldrons. And there's just so much contrast in all of these elements. As an example, just look at the purple going from very dark to bright, and that can be said for all other elements too, which gives this mini quite some depth and weight. And the base is rather experimental, making it look like he's walking through some Twilight Zone or dimensional rift. I think it looks fantastic, but maybe it's a bit too experimental for Golden Demon. Lucas Saba gave us this Morgan Ra, very similar base to his old world winning entry. I really like this granite texture, and I really dig how the moss and vegetation is creeping over it in a very subtle way. The figure itself has this oil paint smoothness to it that he's so well known for, but there's also some cool added texture in most elements, like the bones or the line work of the scythe. I also dig the contrast in the blade up here. Lots of subtle color changes. Just look at the dusty yellow in the weapon. I think this is a very technical piece, really well executed, maybe a little too subtle. The whole model to start with I feel is very hard to make an impression with in the cabinets. Kentaro Ikeda entered this Orc Boy in this pure heavy metal style. I'm obviously referring to the color choices, like from the shade of the orc skin to the way the black is highlighted with that wider stroke followed by a thin line and the bright dots in the corners. I think it's possible to place with this style, but you really got to have it dialed in to perfection and executed without the slightest mistake. Just think back to the Crude winning 40k single last year. Next up, we have this awesome Le Martyrs by Daniel Cholin. I like that you can zoom in on any part here and get some subtle details that you might not catch on first glance. I like there's some kind of battle damage on almost every element. The white on the pauldron and the skull helmet has a lot of scratches and dots. All the gold is reflecting in parts of the armor, like up here at the halo, the cross on his chest, and then down here on the leg where we can see the color of the socket bouncing off of the surrounding metal. And generally, I like the definition of the edges and also the clever use of decals here on the purity seals. And of course, the glowing eyes and the red light reflection on his jaw, the lower side of the hose going to his breather, lower side of the cheekbones and also the temples. Very El Miniaturista-esque. Also the slight sheen of bright color here on the intakes of the jump pack. Magnus Nielsen also scores another finalist. One thing I like about his entries in general is how harmonious the color schemes are. Obviously through picking very harmonizing base colors, but also through muting them a lot. Not a single color screams at you, but also through picking very unifying highlight colors. It looks like there's a very similar cool tone, probably a bright blue in most of these highlight colors, whether that's the green skin parts where it's very obvious or the purple and also the bone color. Another entry we already talked about in my honorable mention section of my Venus video is this Archon by Simon Sikora. It's cool to be able to compare the paint job with the rest of the entries through an official photo. And if you remember, I said this was definitely a favorite of mine from the category. And while this remains unchanged, I'm going to speculate a bit here, which involves some unsolicited feedback, but I talk to Simon now and then, and I believe he won't mind. Also, I had a lot of people ask me why this didn't place, so I think talking about it again is fine. And remember, we are going off of pictures. Games Workshop and the one Simon put on Instagram. And also, we will never officially know what Games Workshop judges are taking into consideration. I'd really like to be a fly on the wall of these judging panels. Maybe if my relationship with Games Workshop was better, but unfortunately it isn't. So from looking at the available pictures for a while, I think maybe there are some small inconsistencies in the planning of this piece. One of my thoughts was that for some reason this effect coming from the dead Eldar being blue and not purple is kind of immersion breaking. Like, I get that the artifact the Archon is holding is emitting the light, and this is the Eldar's soul leaving his body, and that's usually described as being some kind of liquid. But my brain just constantly gets hung up on that color discrepancy. Another factor might be that the light source is not very bright. Like, yes, there is highlights up to white in that artifact, but then there's a lot of black, and I think that might be a little confusing. The brain would expect a bright light source with all the emitted light. Now you could argue this is on purpose, like a dark soul siphon artifact emitting a strange light besides being dark. But remember, any story you want to tell can be misunderstood by someone who looks at your piece without context or enough knowledge. I think this is important while planning your entry, and we'll talk about this later on with other entries too. One important thing when doing OSL is that you have to balance how bright the reflection is in regards to distance of the light source and what material the reflection is happening on. Like, we can see that on this polished armor, the reflection is the brightest with that specular highlight here on the chest, and then the further out it goes, the less intense the reflection would be. However, if a very reflective part and a dull surface are at an equal distance from the light source, the dull surface would not be as bright as the polished one. And I'm not saying that I see anything wrong here, just that this is a tricky thing to balance. Like, how far do you push it on the face emblem on the chest, the banded pattern on the back here, and the duller but overall light sword over there. I also think this highlight would have made more sense if it were a bit bigger, since that chest piece is curving backwards a bit, and now it just kind of looks like there's parallel bands of light that kind of contradict the surface. Anyway, what I'm trying to say with all of this is, remember that while everything you put on your mini might sense to you because you spent so much time with it and you planned it, but someone else looking at it closer might not right away understand all the ideas you had, just because everything is so complex. Just look at this knee part here. There's a magenta reflection on the right side, but because it's rather high up in relation to the light source, there is some bleeding over to the other side. And then on top of that, we have the magenta reflection on the loincloth reflecting back on the knee. How are you going to wrap your head around that? This has been my TED Talk on complex painting in the context of the Golden Demon competition. Thanks a lot for attending. And after all of that, again, I want to stress that this is an amazing entry. Very cool mini and brave color scheme that especially shines on a black background, and absolutely one of my favorites in the competition. These are just some thoughts I had while looking at it for a long time. Before we continue with the next category, let's talk about a serious issue affecting us all. Your privacy is constantly eroded, even in democratic societies, as age verification laws and identity checks are becoming the norm and often require personal data uploads. And your activities are being monitored under the guise of protecting the children from social media. With privacy invasions like these, VPNs are becoming more than watching Netflix Japan. They are about your right to privacy and preventing your data being collected, analyzed and stored by governments and big tech companies. However, most VPNs say they don't track your activity, but data linking you to your activity could be present on their system and is easily requested or seized. Obscura VPN cannot link to your activity. It's not a promise, it's built into their two-party system. There's nothing for them to hand over if they got a request. And they can go one step further, blocking ads and online trackers, reducing your ability to be tracked and fingerprinted. To get Obscura VPN, you can simply follow a link in the description. All you need to do is click Get Started and it will generate an account number for you. No email sign up needed. And even payment can be made anonymously through the Lightning Network. Download the app, enter your account number, and you're ready to go. The internet used to be a place where you could just exist. Now it's a place where you constantly need permission. Might be worth having at least one tool that doesn't ask who you are first. So if you want a privacy-first VPN, go to obscura.com/TROV or use code TROV on checkout to get 25% off of a subscription. Thanks a lot to Obscura VPN for sponsoring this video, and now back to more Golden Demon finalists. In the category of Warhammer 40k unit or kill team, we had 6 finalists. One of them was this Custodes squad by by Sunny Lai. Very cool gold scheme on the bikes. I like the line pattern here a lot. I love that it took general non-metallic metal ideas like bright areas next to dark areas where the object changes shape or angle, and then went ahead and added a very cool interpretation on top of that. The patterns in the metals also kind of support the idea of direction and movement. And I don't know if that was intentional, but that's the impression I get. He also added a cool pattern to the rock formations, and there's some of that ground also reflecting in parts of the minis. You can clearly see the shift towards turquoise in the lower half of the spears, also in the metals here, and there also is some of that in the fins on the bikes. LKA presented an entry that plays with magenta and blue as a complementary contrast. That's funny because the next entry does a very similar thing, and there was another squad winning a demon that was exclusively painted in those two colors. Always a bit hard to grasp everything that's going on in a squad entry from just a single picture, but what I like the most is the definition of the metal. Lots of contrast like on Asmodeus Crossius or the sigils on the standard with the bluish highlights and the purple bounce lights. And again, most of all, I like the composition around the two main colors that are repeating in most elements, even the swords. And here's another entry using these colors, this squad of Rubik Marines by Mohamed Ait Mehdi. I like the layout of the base, really unique approach of presenting the minis with this vertical composition. Of course, it also fits the Siege team very well. In the 40k larger vehicle category, we had 5 finalists, and one thing that Games Workshop does, which is really thoughtful, I think, you will notice that there are never 4 finalists, because that would mean 3 people walking away with a trophy and 1 person kind of singled out, left with nothing. And when you're standing there beside the stage and you're the only one that has to go sit back down, that's kind of a shitty feeling. Especially after you watch 3 others, one by one celebrating and being happy. So usually we get at least 5 or more finalists, or only 3. And you could argue that this is potentially leaving out a 4th painter that might have deserved the finalist, but I really think it's a good decision by Games Workshop to do it this way. In this category, we had 2 Fulgrims, both very different interpretations, which is interesting to see side by side. First, we have this re-entry by Aaron Clark. We have seen this also get a finalist pin in Essen last year, and we've talked about it a lot in that video. Generally, with a lot of the re-entered pieces this year, we didn't see much rework. They basically all were unchanged, and I don't know what the idea behind that is. Maybe it's just one more roll of the dice for a chance of a trophy, but personally I would try to invest some time into reworking certain aspects, especially since it looks like Games Workshop judges were around to give some feedback after the competition was over this time. A Fulgrim is often rendered in these bright colors. Nathan Barth presented this darker version. I really enjoyed the different approach, which makes certain aspects stand out a lot more. I like the highlights back here on the wings. This actually looks a bit like a wrinkly dark plastic with some intense reflections and the rest being rather dark, which I really like. And even though I like the overall darker approach, I think the piece would have benefited from making at least the face stand out a bit more. Of course, the photos are a bit underexposed, so maybe it looks a bit different in hand, but that was my first impression looking at the picture. The 2 aspects I found really unique with this entry was the additional scales freehanded on the main body. I like both the idea to make the piece one of a kind and the execution with the light reflections focused on the upper edges of the scales, making this look really 3-dimensional. And second, the extra heads showing up in these giant crystals on the base. Really cool scene building, almost like a fever dream of Slaanesh. And I'm assuming these have been embedded into resin, and the resin was carved into these crystal shapes, or this was constructed from acetone sheets. In any case, really cool detail, and speaking of detail, I also love how these small cracks were added to the crystals. Epic Scale also had 5 finalists, and it's always fun to see what people are cooking up with these smaller scale minis, as it's often easier to build fun little scenes around them. The smaller scale making it a lot more manageable. Chris Bora managed to grab a finalist with this Orc Flyer clipping an Imperial Tower. Really fun entry with the added freehand details all over the piece. Very colorful entry. Oliver Pratt also constructed a little scene around a bunch of Sons of Horus Marines capturing an Imperial Fist Fortress. And then we gotta talk about a little detail. There was quite a few categories that are missing from this video. simply because they only had 3 finalists. Those were Age of Sigmar Unit, Horse Heresy, Necromunda, Blood Bowl, the Open Competition, and Youngbloods. The next category, with a couple of strong entries that didn't get a trophy, was Diorama, and with a strong 7 finalists. And one of them was this Blood Bowl diorama that got moved from the Blood Bowl category by Markus Klamecker. There's some cool textures here, like the wood. I also like the light effect on the metal here. A cool little scene. Would have definitely been a strong contender in the Blood Bowl category. But obviously with the rules changes, being moved to the diorama category didn't help because it was one of the hardest in this Golden Demon. Another favorite of mine was this piece by Eric McCartney, and I actually forgot to talk about it in the honorable mentions of my winners video, so I'm happy this was eventually awarded a finalist pin so we can talk about it here. It has a really cool atmosphere, the scorched landscape littered with elder elements, especially the soul stones here. All the texture on the base looks really good, and all the fire integrating seamlessly with it and tying together the ground with the damaged rail lord. It's just a really cool concept. The grayish tones working really well with the fire because it's a great base for flames to reflect and cast some OSL. A great effect on the Farseer collecting the soul too, and then the subtle glow cast by the soul stone on the Farseer combined with the red from the fire below makes this a really complex piece. Henrik Mikkelsen grabs a finalist pin with this Space Wolves Proving Grounds and Ulrich overseeing the tryouts. I like the way he built some very incredible terrain, starting with the icy and snowy ground down here, continuing upwards with the rock and all its color variations, and then the icicles up here. Generally, there is just lots of color shifts, like in Ulrich's Crozius, and the swords. And the way the light reflects in the black armor is probably one of my favorite elements. Another icy diorama, this time by Semlens, truly a piece that screams Warhammer. I like how all minis really fit the cold scene with these bluish desaturated highlights, especially visible on the orc skins and the yellow armor parts of both the orcs and the shoulders of the Space Wolves. I'm always impressed when people enter a lot of minis. Like this one is 15 plus miniatures, all painted to this very high standard. There's also some funny elements in there, like the Suicide Squig. Warhammer Age of Sigmar had 6 finalists in total. One of those not winning a trophy was David Aroba's Martial conversion. Very cool kit bash with the head swap, the hammer, and the skull being added to the head of the horse. He has painted this in a very somber style, dark and moody, making small additions like the glow effect of the lantern really stand out. The color choices draw everything together, like there seems to be the same color used in a lot of these elements. And skull and skin tones of the horse. Checker pattern also has the salmon beige, and it also repeats in the non-metallic metal and the face. I like that the model at the same time integrates with the background through this muted style, but also stands out against it, just being that tiny bit brighter and more colorful. I also like the credible looking groundwork down here, subtle effect, but very hard to pull off convincingly. By contrast, we have this more painterly base on Bruce Rose's Plaguebearer. I like how the rendering of these bubbles adds some extra three-dimensionality, and it makes them really stand out, mostly through the bright overall definition and the bounce lights. The color scheme plays with some complementary contrasts. The yellows are shaded with purple. Maybe the texture could have been a bit more crisp here and there, and the verdigris looks like it's gotten out of hand a little, which usually happens to me a lot when adding these last brightest parts. I always got to make sure to add them only in tiny areas over the darker layers. Magnus Nielsen also scored a finalist pin in this category with this Ogre Chieftain and the 3 little Noblars. Lots of different materials to render here, some crude armor, tusks, leather straps, wood, and also this fur. I really like that variety, but also makes it difficult to get everything right and rendered to the same standard. He also added his trademark texture to the skin of the ogre. In general, we've seen a lot of pieces being on the grittier side this time. I feel like that's maybe a bit of a trend, but Magnus here with an entry full of detail. There's even some detail in the detail, like on the threads that hold the pants together. There's an added line pattern. Magnus scores another finalist pin in the next category, Age of Sigmar Large or War Machine. This category also had 6 finalists, strong category, and I think what has been said for the ogre can be repeated here. So many different materials, all rendered with a lot of attention to detail. Here there's a bit more focus on the skin, lovely transitions from the brighter fleshy tones to the darker skin on the shoulders and hands. Again, everything has some added structure that isn't sculpted, like the line work on his belly here, and the hammered metal texture on the armor plates. Borja also brought this Ionos Cryptborn that we have already seen in Essen, where it did not score a finalist. Between this and his Magnus vs. Logan Grimnar duel, this must have been a giant transport case. We talked about this one a couple of times already. It's an awesome entry, very expressive painting style, lots of complexity, especially in these metal reflections. And there's tons of additional detail, like the ropes he added to the base, and there's also a bit of resin water on there, which we can see in this shot. The reds are super bright, which makes it stand out a lot in cabinets. And then there's the shift towards colder colors on the outside of the wing. I've never actually seen a shot of the backside, not even in the turntables on his Instagram. So it's hard to tell whether there's one side that is defined a bit more with warmer tones and then the back is rendered in cooler colors. At least the side of the wing and the underside of the tail would suggest so. Simon Sikora also with a re-entry from Essen. I can only repeat myself, a stark contrast to an entry like Ionos from Borja. Very clean rendition, making sure every brush stroke is thought through and the gradients are as smooth as possible. I like that main reflection on the body. Personally, I'd maybe also had pushed the highlights towards this brightness on the wings, which are a very similar color. But yeah, again, really cool color transitions, like on the scales of the tail, smooth gradients, additional texture rendered on the stone base, a very meticulous overall painting. Nathan Cartwright entered this dwarf in Warhammer The Old World. It's a cool contrast to Magnus Nielsen's Slayer that used the same axe, where the focus is more on smoothness and less on texture. There's a little texture, of course, in the green cloth and the beard and hair, of course, but the non-metallic metal has more focus on color transitions and ambient light. I really like all these tones that are reflecting in the metal, though I'm not always 100% sure what's reflecting, like maybe the gold and bright beard in the lower blade of the axe, and then the sky in the upper blade. Another fun little detail is the dwarven face carved into the stone down here on the base. Another finalist pin goes to Daniel Cholin and his Wood Elf. The first thing that stands out to me is the almost sky-earth effect on the chest armor. There's some turquoise reflecting from the cloak, and I guess green tones from the rest of the clothes. A lovely texture on the leather parts of the armor, and these gems have some cool reflection patterns too. I also like the speckling on the falcon's chest, and the scheme feels very natural as a whole. David Diamondstone scored a pin with this Yujin. I really expect to see this model more and more in the overall category, as I think there's just so many possibilities here to make this model stand out. David went for a simpler approach here, adding a few freehand patterns here on the back and in the front on these smaller elements. Nicolas Rubens Mortensen also placed in the final 7 of this category with this Shagot. Lots of scratch build aspects, like all the red clothing in the front, some of the scale texture, all of the hair, and some of the upper face too. I like that he tried to build his own version here, bashing together some different models to bring this one to life. The painting, of course, is as meticulous as we are used from him. Very cool non-metallic metal patterns on the steel, lots of weathering, especially the rust patterns are not that easy to pull off over a lot of whites. The highlight patterns and definition on the shapes, like the muscle groups on the skin, is spectacular, almost making it look like a living creature. Lots of texture on all of the elements again, even though I'd almost say it's a little too similar. There's not much difference between the dots and scratch pattern on the armor and the patterns on the skin. Even the cloth parts and also the scales. It looks a little bit like he got hit by thousands of little shrapnel pieces all over. However, you just gotta admire the dedication to render every little detail, look at the studs and the little intricate reflections. A Blood Bowl had 5 finalists, and one of them is this orc by Alessandro Marinone. I've seen the Sork a lot during the last few Golden Demons. There's definitely some models in the range that are more popular and successful than others. This is a bit of a more traditional interpretation, deep reds and whitish clothes, leather and traditional orc green, where there's a clear trend towards texturing most surfaces. This focus more on blending. But the model still manages to have great contrast on all the elements, especially the reds and the leather parts. Another highlight for me is the undead pinned on his shoulder spike. I love the green-blue hues on the skin shifting into purple and skin tones. Daniel Cholin presented a cool rendition of this Norse player. I'm especially fond of the very natural looking skin tones, especially in the face, shifting from a brighter forehead to subtle reds in the cheeks, really expressive eyes too. I also like how the upper legs are defined without a lot of deep shading, and even without that they still look muscular and bulky. I'm also a fan of the fur texture on the wolf head. Middle-earth also had 5 finalists. The first one is this armored Pippin. Lovely little scene built around the mini, and then some well-placed highlights, like on the helmet especially. And the last finalist entry in this category comes from Matthias Eigner, one of the Easterling characters. I think he's called Raza. We don't see this one entered a lot. I love the contrasts, like on the gold on the chest, including the blues and the studs, and then all the bright highlights on the red. I also dig the wood grain structure a lot. In the duel category, we had 5 finalists, and one of the pins goes to John Ninas. And I wrote down a couple of points that came to mind when looking at the finished piece. And since then, John and Miniac put out a Trapped on the Plastic episode talking about these things too. And there was a lot of overlap. So I feel a little bit more confident sharing my thoughts. Also, some of these aspects are going to bring us full circle with a couple of general things that we said earlier about creating narrative pieces for Golden Demon and painting competitions in general. So I really like the color scheme of the troll. The way it's rendered gives me strong David Soper vibes. So I wonder if his work was an inspiration. And there really is a strong focus on contrast. Just look at the face and how deep some of these shadows are, and then a strong edge highlights to present the piece that looks evenly refined all over, especially visible on the scales. I also like the color shifts, like that yellow in some places on the arms and the greenish tint around where the skin meets the scale covered skin. The way the fox is floating on this part of cloth also works really well, and I think that's a good solution, making it fly or jump rather, and I really dig the intensity of the fire. I definitely think the fox is less refined than the troll, but that is probably because there isn't enough features on it to follow an outline in the style John chose. There's no major muscle groups, the horns are smooth, the fur texture is rather soft, and I'd say the fox is the part of the duel that dragged the whole piece down a little. On the troll, the only thing I don't really like is the texture of the wooden clubs. It just doesn't quite sell them to me. We always talk about this next aspect when we hit the duel category, and the fact is there just has to be some kind of interaction between the models. Now, John's idea was that this is a surprise attack, so a fraction of a second before the troll recognizes the threat and reacts to it. But remember, the duel category is all about the interaction between two foes, and placing 2 minis pointing at each other is not going to be enough. And I guess maybe there just wasn't enough interaction between the two for the jury. Also, like we said earlier, if you add a narrative element, there always is the possibility that this narrative is not immediately recognizable to someone else looking at your piece for the first time without context. For a category like Duel, there's lots of layers why one entry might get chosen over the other. It could be consistency, both minis have to be equally well painted, the interaction has to be there, conversions always seem to be a plus to make your scene work. Thinking back to the winner piece of Magnus versus Logan Grimnar, the more iconic you can make your scene, the better. And if I had to guess, I think there's just a tiny bit of everything we just mentioned that made this entry only score a finalist pin. One last entry in this category was this duel between an Ultramarine Terminator captain and the Parasite of Mortex. And during the last Golden Demon, we said that there's multiple grades of interaction between minis. The first one being placing minis opposite each other with little interaction. The last one being conversions and manipulating poses and parts to create an interaction that the models alone don't allow for. And in the middle sits an approach that Elias took here, finding the interaction in the poses of 2 existing minis and placing them so it still looks like the interaction was intended with the sculpts. So the Parasite wrapping around the Terminator and the Captain looking like he's trying to turn around to see what's going on and screaming at the Xenos in terror. And with that, we wrap up this year's finalist video. It's always cool to see what other minis besides the winners were considered for the final round of judging. It always gives a good idea about how tough the competition was and which aspects are important for winning a Golden Demon. Let me know which one was your favorite and if you were impressed by this year's turnout or not. This also wraps up the coverage of Golden Demon Adepticon. I'm really looking forward to the next one in Essen, Germany. Hope you learned something. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.